Yeah, and open to Acts 15. Again, my name's Evan. It's wonderful to be able to talk about Jesus with you. Excited about this morning, this afternoon now. I'm not one for titling sermons so much, but that's the way we roll around here, and I can't avoid titling it anything other than Don't Be Afraid. So it's a sermon on fear. I tend to be a very fearful person. Anybody with me? Fear. Okay, the rest of you are afraid to raise your hands. You're not being honest. So this is for you, yes. If you have a Bible, Acts 18. So verse 1 gives us background. See, right behind me, there's Corinth and Athens directly above my head. The journey is from Athens to Corinth in verse 1. So it says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. That's verse 1. So I don't know, he may have taken, he definitely took a boat of some kind, it seems, because there's no land bridge there. Years after this journey, Paul would write to the Corinthians, Christians in Corinth. He would write this: when I came to you, brothers and sisters, I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. So it's no wonder the story up till now has not gone too hot for Paul. He's been jailed and kicked out of cities and mobbed and beaten and flat out unheard. We know from his letter to Thessalonica, which is way up there in the north, he wrote a letter to them later on, and he said in that letter that he was worried sick with anxiety about the pockets of Christians there while he was on this journey from Athens to Corinth. So Paul must have traveled from Athens to Corinth in a really dejected mood from all his failure and all of his beating. Maybe he was sick. Maybe from all the beating and imprisonment and filthy, nasty ancient jails. Who knows? But for sure, we know he was only human. Paul is only human, and at this point, he is very probably thinking, what worse can happen? And how in the world had God allowed things to turn out so badly at this point? So now we're going to read the narrative. We're going to read Paul's story in Corinth. And I want you to keep your eye on the details. Watch how Paul makes his decisions. Watch how circumstances shift. Watch how Paul connects with people and connects people with people. Watch the details, because I think the God of all comfort is in the details. So verse 2, there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade both Jews and Greeks. Okay, so Paul, the tent-making preacher now, hits the jackpot. He hits the jackpot here in Corinth because he ends up connecting with a Christian couple who ran a tent-making business. He happens to be a tent maker, or the word there in Greek is also leather worker. So the butcher would kill the animal, send the skin to the tanner would dry the animal, send the dried skin to the leather worker, and that was Paul's job in the assembly line of the ancient Near East. He was the leather worker, the guy who made those animal skins into like tents or whatever. So that's his job. Jewish law required that every theology student learn a trade. And that was his. It just so happens in Corinth, he found people to work for, and they happened to be Christians and likely had unbelieving leather workers employed at their business. So Paul hit the jackpot as a missionary at this point. This is what we like to call, you just heard it in the announcements, this is what we like to call missional community. Doing what you already do, but with other Christians, for the greater purpose of living out and sharing the gospel in your already spheres of life, okay? This is strategic of Paul, and this is an important point. This is an important point for us here at Westside. If you have a skill, hobby, interest, sport, if you're a student, job, then you have a tool for heavenly mission. Paul's job as a tent maker was always a means to an end. And this is a core identity piece of who we are, who we believe God has called us to be as Westside. A family of missionary disciples. You can't spend too much time here before hearing that we are a family of missionary disciples who scatter out into the city, doing life together as family for the greater purpose of God's mission to the city of Portland. So let me ask you, take a moment pastorally just to ask you how you're doing with that. How are you doing with mission? How are you doing taking what God has already wired you to do and to be and to love and and wrapping it around God's heart for those places and spaces. How are you doing with that? We have an entire team here at Westside. They're called, conveniently, the Missional Living Team, who are explicitly devoted to equipping and empowering you to live in this way, to live as a family together of missionary disciples of Jesus, scattering together in missional communities in our spheres of life. So hit up the info booth right out there in the lobby for any guidance or direction or prayer, counsel on what it would look like for you to be better equipped in that way. So along with scattering in your already spheres of life, we see Paul doing something else. Once a week, in this text, once a week, he's not just scattering, doing his job for the sake of the gospel, but he's gathering one Sabbath a week, every week to worship, study the scriptures, pray, and break bread. Every Sabbath in the synagogue, trying to persuade everyone that Jesus is Lord. So here we see our gather, scatter DNA. We didn't make this stuff up. It's not just like a Jesus church philosophy. It's like 1900-year-old DNA, okay? So didn't start with us. We couldn't make it up. It's brilliant. It's God. So read on, 18:5. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent of it. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus. He's a worshiper of God. Verse 8, Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord. And many Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. Okay? So here we see Paul, as soon as he's financially capable, he cuts away from the leather-making, tent-making workforce to focus on what he was born to do obediently, and that's to preach Jesus as Messiah, and this time specifically to the Jews. So why does he preach Jesus as Messiah? Because it's true. And I want us to really let that sink into how we see things, because Paul knew that apart from faith in Jesus as Messiah, his Jewish neighbors would die in their sin and never know the salvation of Jesus. And that drove him. Does that drive us? Just read Romans 9. It drove Paul. Romans 9 through 11 is that famous passage where he talks about what God is doing in Israel. And he starts out by saying, my heart breaks for my fellow countrymen. I wish I was cut off from God's family for eternity if they would all be just included, if they just be in the family. I'd give my place up in heaven for them, he says, which is a crazy thing to say, but that's where he was at. His heart broke for his neighbors. So how is our heart in relation to our neighbor? Because this reality needs to motivate us all the way down to our choice of job. So Paul goes into full-time preaching, and that's when things start to heat up. The Jews violently, it says, abuse. They violently resist Paul. So Paul gives up on the Jews and focuses on the non-Jews, the pagans and prostitutes in Corinth. And Corinth was a pleasure dome. It was known for its Aphrodite sex cult. There were 1,000 prostitutes on any given day in the streets, ready to just prostitute themselves sexually for the sake of this pagan worship thing that they did. So you can't really go anywhere without seeing it in Corinth. Absolutely stressful place for Paul to be. And people start converting. They start believing. Many, it says, verse 8, many of the Christians in Corinth, many of the Corinthians became Christians who heard Paul. And this had to be really encouraging for Paul, finally, encouragement at this point. But it was nothing compared to the encouragement he was just about to receive, because Jesus visits Paul. Jesus himself. Look at verse 9. One night, the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I'm with you. And no one's going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city. Profound and beautiful. Listen to the words of Jesus. So Paul comes to Corinth super fearful, dejected, bordering on despair, if not fully despairing, and probably fully despairing. And one night Jesus comes and says, don't be afraid. Keep speaking. Don't stop. I'm with you. You will be okay. You have no idea how beautiful things are shaping up to be. And Paul's response in verse 11, so Paul stays in Corinth for a year and a half. I love that. Paul's response is obedience to the command not to fear. And what does he do there? Teaching them the word of God. And what does teaching the word of God mean? Well, in the New Testament, the phrase word of God, it most often means the message about Jesus being Lord and Messiah. That's the word of God. In other words, to teach the word of God is to help people see that Jesus not only fulfills the storyline of the Bible, but Jesus fulfills the storyline of every person in human history. That ultimately, for everyone, everywhere, Jesus is what God has to say. That's to teach the word. Jesus is what God has to say, to unpack that personally for people in the present moment. Jesus is what God has to say to you. Jesus is perfect theology. Jesus himself is perfect theology. So, now we're going to read through the rest of the chapter and watch God's guiding hand, watch his story unfold for Paul. Remember, watch the details. God is in them. He's clearly there. So verses 12 through 28. I'm barely going to make any comments at all. We're just going to read and watch. Watch God work in the details. Verse 12. Sorry, I have sniffles, kind of sick. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to them, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you, but since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be judge of such things. So he drove them off. Then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul. And Gallio showed no concern whatever. Verse 18, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchreae because of a vow he had taken. That's weird, randomly. There's a record of his haircut right there in this middle of the story. That was a sign of Jewish devotion, a 30-day vow of cutting hair. It was all part of the way that they would follow after God. So Paul continues his devotional rhythms. Even in the midst of trouble, he continues his walk with God. Verse 19, then they arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. So where's Ephesus? Right there on the tip of Asia, there, ancient Asia, not modern Asia, it's modern Turkey. But he leaves Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus. Okay, that's interesting. Why would he leave his buddies that he's been working with for a couple? It's interesting just that he would leave them there. Verse 19, he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. Verse 20, when they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will, appealing to God's will. Then he set sail from Ephesus, still leaving Priscilla and Aquila behind. Must have been a sad day. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So it looks like business as usual. All these relational connections and disconnections in Ephesus. But then look in verse 24. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about the Jews accurately, taught about Jesus accurately, though he only knew the baptism of John. So he's got talent, he's got chops, he's a preacher, he's fully studied, kind of been to seminary, except not the full gospel seminary, just the baptism of John seminary. He doesn't know the whole Jesus thing yet, which is pretty awesome, yet possibly dangerous because it's not the full gospel. So thankfully, Paul left Priscilla and Aquila, right where Apollos would happen to be. Love this. Verse 26, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. Verse 27, when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. When he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed. thankfully, Priscilla and Aquila, husband and wife duo, gave Apollos a crash course in Jesus-centered theology. They wouldn't have been present had Paul not left them there, and Paul would never left them there if he didn't leave at the appropriate time, and it just seems like God's fingerprints are all over this. And then finally, 28, for he vigorously refuted, this is Apollos, vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. I don't know about you, I see God all over that in the details. God unrolling his plan through like the day to day, from place to place. If God wills, I'll go there, go here. God is in the details, okay? And Paul realizes this at a turning point. And there's this giant hinge, like a door swinging on a hinge, okay? There's this giant hinge in the story, and it's like Paul's giant turning point, and it's our turning point. It's the turning point for all of us. It's the moment we truly hear Jesus saying, don't be afraid. It's a turning point for all of us when we truly hear that. So to be honest, our text this morning isn't really just one text. It's every text where Jesus says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. It's what Jesus says to Peter when Peter's afraid because he's a sinner. Don't be afraid. It's what Jesus says to the little flock when they're frightened, his followers. Don't be afraid. It's what Jesus says to Jairus when his daughter is dead. Don't be afraid. It's what Jesus says to the frightened men in the storm. Don't be afraid. It's what Jesus says to the frightened women on Easter morning. Don't be afraid. It's what Jesus says to Paul when he had every reason to fear danger physically and failure spiritually. Listen to what Jesus says, Westside family. Don't be afraid. Did you know this is Jesus' most often repeated command in the Bible, like some 360 odd times? This is God's most often repeated command. Don't be afraid. And today is the first Sunday of Advent, and Advent is all about anticipating the voice of God in the silence, the light in the darkness, the arrival of Jesus. Advent reminds us that Jesus is what God has to say. The Word of God made flesh and blood and moved into our neighborhood. Jesus is what God has to say. And do you know what Jesus says to us right now? Don't be afraid. Think about it. Throughout his life, from beginning to end, from Galilee to Capernaum, Galilee and Capernaum were the same, so I'd rather say it this way. From Galilee to the upper room, from Capernaum to Jerusalem, on mountain and on sea, to men and to women, to individuals and to multitudes, before his death and after his resurrection, Jesus says, don't be afraid. It seems as if this is what heaven has to say to earth. Because from the beginning, fear has always been one of Satan's primary tools for advancing the kingdom of darkness. And I need to make an important distinction here. There is fear as a God-given fight or flight mechanism, and there's fear as the Satan-sabotaged what-if reflex. One is God-given, and the other is Satan's sabotage. That rush of adrenaline we fear, we call it panic or whatever, in the face of present danger, it actually can give us a boost of strength to be successful in escaping actual present danger. And that's God-given as an instinct. But Satan and his minions, I love that word, minions. Satan and his minions, as they tend to do, they've grabbed fear and they've taken God's gift and corrupted it by using it against us, mainly by planting what-ifs in our minds. What if I'm not good enough? What if I'm not able enough? What if they leave me? What if they shame me? What if an intruder kicks down my door? What if the reason that person hasn't texted me back yet because they actually hate me? What if that foreigner is plotting my death? What if I end up scaring away the next person I date? What if something awful happens and fill in the blank? Satan's best work is behind all those what if questions that tie you up in knots of fear and keep you from living life in the now. In the words of Jamie Winship, God is Lord of reality and now. The devil reigns in the hypothetical. The question, what if, invites Satan's speak. This is the kind of fear that Satan speak that Jesus commands us not to believe when he tells us don't be afraid. So however we understand the fall of Adam and Eve, it's clear to me that the first effect of the fall was fear. The first recorded human speech after the fall. I heard you in the garden and I was afraid, so I hid myself. This is not the godly fear of Proverbs 1, the fear of the Lord that's the beginning of wisdom that draws you near to God because you fear displeasing him because you're so pleased in him. This is the demonic fear of James 2 that says, you believe in one God? Awesome. You do kind of well because even the demons believe and tremble. This is demonic fear right here. At the fall, something has gone so wrong in Adam that he imagines God as a monster. Something has gone wrong in humankind so that we imagine horrors where in fact our help is coming from. To be afraid of God, it's an effect of the fall. I believe we are at our worst and do our worst when we are driven and tormented by fear. Think about it. When you take fear off the table, remove fear, how many true enemies do you really have left? Probably none. Take fear off the table. How many worried thoughts do you have? Probably none. Fear is imagination gone wrong. It's imagining a future without God. I think that's another effect of the fall. We're always just imagining death. At the moment that first sin took place in the garden, a line was crossed, and we're told the result is death, but they don't physically die immediately, but what they do begin to do immediately is dread death. Now they're aware of the final curtain. Now they're aware that death is actually what is awaiting them. And so with the fall, we have the birth of fear. And most, if not all fear, is founded and stems from the fear of death. Maybe that's why when angels visit humans in the Bible, almost every time, the angels visit humans all the way from Genesis to Revelation over and over, the first thing the angel says to the human being is what? Don't be afraid. I think this is what heaven has to say to earth. Don't be afraid. I was pointing at nothing. There it is. This is what heaven has to say to earth. That is heaven's message to earth. It seems like the conversation between heaven and earth goes something like this. I'm afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm afraid. Don't be afraid. No, I'm actually afraid. Actually, don't be afraid. Angels say it, prophets say it, psalmists say it. Jesus is the final and full word of God, and Jesus says, don't be afraid. Hebrews 2:14-15 says, since the children have flesh and blood, he too, speaking of Jesus, shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that's the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Most, if not all fear, is ultimately founded and rooted and stems from the fear of death. Most, if not all fear, is a form of the fear of death. This might not be immediately recognizable to you. You might say I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of just spiders or something. I'm afraid of other things. Well, I would argue, as many do, those are just forms of fear that stem from the fear of extinction, the fear of death. And when I say they're forms of the fear of death, I'm saying it's the fear of separation. The loss of control, the loss of place, the loss of position, the loss of possessions. These are forms of the fear of death. But the fear of death is a lie. It's a lie. And it's proven to be a lie in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead is God proving that the fear of death is a lie. Through the power of God, the risen Christ exposes that lie. And what is it that the risen Christ says to us? Don't be afraid. Death is not the end. Death is that common experience of loss we will all undergo at some point or another in our lives. It's that loss of control, that loss of place, loss of possession, loss of location. But Jesus says, don't be afraid. That's not the end. Death is not something that is terminal. It's a transition. You pass through it. We use the word terminal to talk about diseases that lead to death, but death itself is not terminal. Death itself is not the final destination. Death is something you pass through. And in various ways, you will pass through it many times in life. Some of you in this room have passed through it. So how many of you have experienced a time that you thought was the end, like it even felt like the end, but it was really a new beginning? What you thought was the end turned out to be Easter. What you thought was only darkness turned out to be the hours before dawn, like the music before the words. On this first Sunday of Advent, we anticipate the Word. The Word, Jesus, the Word, is what God has to say. And Jesus says, don't be afraid. And because that's true, we can say it to each other every day. Because that's true, we can follow Jesus in saying it to ourselves. Which got my mind going on a little weird brain trip. My mind is a weird place. Thought experiments excite me. I like how, so have you ever wondered what it might be like if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self? No. Yes, there's some yeses. Some are you. Okay, yeah, like what? Like it's a fun thought experiment, for real. I think it's actually can be helpful. In my mind, I can picture myself giving myself like advice or counsel or like correction, like, hey, dude, that thing you're doing, stop it. No, don't be like this. Like I can picture myself giving myself like dating tips or like life coaching strategies, like, but here's the truth. Like I'm not sure much of that would be heard. Like new psychological evidence is like the human male brain isn't even fully developed until like 30. They just extended the age, which explains a lot for me. So I don't know how much of these tips or strategies, I don't know how much of my mind now is transferable to me then. But what I do think is transferable, what I do think would be heard is this: trust me, don't be afraid. That's what I think would be heard. So like, let's do it. So like in my mind, I hop into Doc Brown's DeLorean. I mean, I know Matthew McConaughey and like Interstellar and black hole space travel is all hip and cool right now, but I'm partial to the Doc. So hop into the DeLorean, of course, making sure that the flux capacitor is full of plutonium. And I set the clock back to 1986. I'm 5 years old. Ronald Reagan's president. Halley's Comet completely captivates me up in the sky. And Oprah Winfrey hits national TV. Good days. Song of the year. We are the world. We are the children. So it's such good times. Most importantly, Nintendo is introduced in the US. So good. So I want to go back and talk to a 5-year-old child. Who's just moved 100 miles north from San Diego to Orange County. A new school, heading off to kindergarten, new church, new friends. He won't like all of it, but he'll like some of it, but he fears the worst. And as he goes to his classes, he learns the fear of failure. One day he grabbed his cardboard cutout shoe that was for like practicing tying laces, and he threw it at his teacher's like, this is stupid, and threw it at his teacher's face. Because he was the only one of his friends who couldn't quite tie the bow yet. It's a fear. It's the fear of not measuring up. The fear of not being accepted, the fear of not succeeding. This is when I first encountered like competition and grades and popularity and schoolyard fights. And I want to go talk to that 5-year-old. And I just want to let him know, like, don't worry about all that. It doesn't mean anything. You are loved and accepted as you are. God is so with you right now. So trust me, don't be afraid. So back in the DeLorean, set the clock 10 years forward, 1996. It's the 90s, a lot has changed. I'm like 15 now. A lot has changed since 5 years old. I'm 15, Bill Clinton's president. Michael Jordan and the Bulls just destroyed Sean Kemp and the Sonics. Yes, very good. I had no dog in the fight. I'm from California, so sorry. Michael Jordan's amazing. And Seal gets Song of the Year. Even, I don't know, it's weird, like Seal, even though everybody knew Alanis Morissette's way better. So more importantly, the inaugural year of the PlayStation 1. You can tell where my priorities are. So I want to talk to that 15-year-old who just moved 100 miles south again from Orange County to San Diego. This is way before social media. So like the host of friends that he invested his life into creating, this like community, gone, cut off, successful track and field teams, basketball, football, all of that done. Now he's the brand new kid in braces, sideburns, big old mutton chop sideburns, and a bowl cut. And at his little private Christian school, which is way smaller than his previous school, with no official sports programs this time, in a 10th grade class of about 9 people. So, and by the way, one of his new classmates is this like ridiculously cute girl who won't give him the time of day, which doesn't help his teenage insecurities at all. This is where my 5-year-old fear evolves into my 15-year-old fear, because it's the same fears, just recycled. The fear of failure, fear of rejection, not measuring up, the fear of human opinion, afraid of losing human approval. So like now with these years of hindsight, I'm watching God in the details now, and I want to go talk to that 15-year-old. I want to say, God is so for you. Don't worry about what is said over you. Don't worry about what is said over you, because God sees. God sees. This is all assuming a 15-year-old will even listen. A 15-year-old listening, that is way more improbable than time travel. So assuming 15-year-olds can listen, then we can accept time travel. So I would say God is so for you, because God sees you and he's with you. So trust me, don't be afraid. Besides, I would possibly add, that ridiculously cute girl in English class will be the mother of your 5 children. Just kidding, I wouldn't tell myself that. That'd be cheating. That'd totally be cheating. It'd blow up the space-time continuum or something. So back on the DeLorean, 1996 goes to 2006, 10 more years ahead. 25, married with 2 boys now. W. Bush, president. The 9th planet, Pluto, not a planet anymore. Voted out by scientists. So bummed over that. Now only 8, my mind is permanently blown now. And U2 wins 5 out of 5 Grammy Awards, of course. I've been a super busy 70 hours a week youth pastor for 6 years by this point. So I want to talk to this youth pastor. He senses a clear calling to like write and record fresh songs for the church. He even sees God opening a lot of doors that would lead him to believe that that's where God is leading. But he's conflicted because he doesn't want to be known as the youth pastor who quit. The leadership at his church has given him an ultimatum. He's secretly afraid if he like follows his sense of calling, then he won't have a paycheck to feed everyone. And he'll be the guy who abandoned youth for music. And he's afraid of what that will look like. These are just my 5-year-old, 15-year-old, stale fears regurgitated 20 years over. That's what they are. Let's call them what they are. So I want to talk to that new dad. And I want to say something like, when your head is full of fear, don't live in your head. Live in the moment with the good shepherd, because he's really good at shepherding. And he's with you. He's with you. So don't be afraid. And then my 25-year-old's starting to get a mind of his own at that moment. So he's like, comes back. He's like, so it'll be okay then? So tell me, it'll be okay? And I'm like, I can't tell you that. It wouldn't even help you. What I can tell you is the most